Hello and welcome back to part 3 of my interview with Nadine McCombs Hansen. Did I get that right?
Yes.
It's January 24th, 2017. We've talked about Nadine's life, growing up in the church, going to BYU, getting married in the temple, and then we talked about her feminist awakenings with the ERA and church history and dialogue and Sunstone and those sorts of things. And it's kind of almost taking us up to her decision after having 4 children to go back to law school.
Right.
After she had studied, gotten a minor in religious studies and studied religion and that sort of thing. During the break, we had a listener ask us your thoughts on the Book of Abraham. You said you had a story or two that were interesting about that.
Yes.
So before we jump into law school and what happened after, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Book of Abraham and what you learned about it? Would it have been in the 80s?
Okay. Actually, no, it wasn't the 80s. Because in the 80s I lived in Cupertino. It was in the 70s.
Okay, all right.
And in San Jose, we had a Rosicrucian museum. And I don't really know very much about...
Which is a religion, right?
Well,
sort of.
Yeah, it's kind of a religion. They're kind of secretive about what they believe, so I don't really know. But I know they have a lot of interest in Egypt. And so one day, a friend of mine in the ward and we took our kids and we went over to the Rosicrucian Museum. And so you go in there and they've got like this one room that's kind of like maybe an Egyptian tomb where they've got all these Egyptian writings on the wall, and they've got displays with the canopic jars that you see in the Book of Abraham that are under the altar that supposedly Abraham is being slain on. Only the scene is a little different because there's not an Egyptian priest that's going to kill Abraham, but it's the head of Anubis on it. Not the way Joseph Smith reconstructed it. And so I saw all that, and I also, around that time, I had a book that was about the Book of Abraham. I can't remember, I think the author's name was McGavin or something, where he talked about finding the Book of Abraham, but I don't really remember very much from that book. But what came out around then is Hugh Nibley's book, The Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri. And this was this like thick 300-page tome with thousands of footnotes about the Book of Abraham. It's Hugh Nibley's apologetic for it. Now, of course, what happened with the Book of Abraham, for anybody who might be listening who doesn't know, is Joseph Smith bought these papyri, and he said that he translated them into a book that we know as the Book of Abraham. And then when, after Joseph Smith was killed, his widow had the papyri, and it was donated to a museum, and it was believed to be lost in the Chicago fire. But in the 1960s, it was found in another museum in New York, and the church eventually acquired it in the, I think, mid-60s maybe. And when Egyptologists looked at it, where they actually had the papyri itself to look at rather than just the drawings that had been made of the facsimiles in the book, they discovered that it was what is known as the breathing permit of Hor, or Horus, and it didn't have anything to do with Abraham. It has, it comes from, I don't know, I think between the 1st and 3rd century BC, if I remember right. And so this has presented a problem for the church, and here we are, more than 50 years later, and only recently was this acknowledged by the church in one of the essays. Well, when I read Hugh Nibley's book, it was an effort to sort of construct an idea that there was an Egyptian endowment of sorts that taught people about the afterlife. It's been so long, I don't remember all he said. But one of the things that he talked about in the book was that there was other papyri, and and there's this description of one that I think has colors on it and things, and we don't have that one. And so my takeaway from the book was that maybe what we have now as Joseph Smith Papyri didn't contain, it isn't the part that Joseph Smith translated into the Book of Abraham. Well, that worked for a little while, but then I found out that actually, well, for one thing, the facsimiles, we know what the facsimiles say, and it isn't what Joseph Smith says that they say. So that was problematic, and I'm not sure what all we would lose if we decided to decanonize the Book of Abraham, given its historical problems and the problems that it's going to continue to cause for people who believe that Joseph Smith actually translated it, and then they find out that it isn't. We might be better off to just not have it. That's the only place in Mormon scripture, really, that denied priesthood to blacks.
Mm-hmm.
And what if we didn't have that in our scripture? I'm not sure that wouldn't be a good idea.
Right. So for a listener who's saying, what do I do with the Book of Abraham? What do you say to the listener?
Well, what I did is I just didn't give it very much credence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about going to law school as a mother of four children.
Yeah, so
and what you were thinking.
Well, I believe in justice and in the rule of law, and I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, so I went to law school. And I don't know that there's a whole lot to talk about going to law school itself. In terms of being a Mormon woman going to law school, Mormonism is kind of funny about some things, because on the one hand, they have strict gender roles for women. But on the other hand, they're really quite proud of their women who break outside of those gender roles and who do other things. And so I got huge amounts of support from ward members when I was going to law school. People were really wonderful. And they were happy that I was doing it, and they gave me lots of encouragement. And I'm trying to think if there was really anything while I was in law school that happened. Mostly while I was in law school, I was too busy to think about very much other stuff. But I did still continue to have a lot of cognitive dissonance about the church, and I continued to think about these things. In fact, it may have been the time when I had the most cognitive dissonance. And I was trying to decide what to do with this. And on the one hand, my whole family was part of the church. My husband was a believer. He didn't read as many things as I did. He was always really supportive of me doing what I wanted to do, of the things that I read, and he didn't particularly want to read them, but he didn't mind that I did. And I didn't want to cause problems. My marriage was more important to me than really bringing up these problems a lot. And so he certainly knew I was unhappy with the way the church treated women. But he didn't treat me like that. He was supportive of everything that I was trying to do. So I just didn't make waves, and I was really busy anyway. So then after I graduated from law school and got a job, and now I had a little more time to think about where things were going as far as the church was concerned. And so that's when I really started to think about things that I'd kind of just put on the back burner for a while. And so what I came up with, it was, like I was telling you, I was reading some of the things from the Jesus Seminar. And coming to understand that the sort of fundamentalist view of Christianity is also problematic in a lot of ways. But there's another way you can think about Christianity, and you can decide to follow the teachings of Jesus and to live a Christian life. And we can't really sort out exactly what happened so long ago. But sometimes I hear people say that Christian apologetics is just as problematic as Mormon apologetics. And I don't really believe that. We know we have a real place, time and place for Jesus. We know a lot about what the world was like back then. And deciding whether or not you believe in the resurrection is obviously a matter of faith. And I tend to think that Christianity arose because the people who were the followers of Jesus had this experience of him being alive still. Whether that's a literal resurrection, they had a sense of his presence. And that's enough for me. Whether the resurrection is literal or not, I believe in the things that he taught, and I believe that people did experience a sense of him being present with them. And so I could quite easily be a Christian, except that the so many Christian churches are so fundamentalist, I could never do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're clinging, even now you're clinging to your Christianity.
Yeah.
But at the time, law school and thereafter, you mentioned that in that timeline. Why?
Well, just that was really when I was sort of going through this process of sorting out whether I could believe in God, whether I could be a Christian, whether I could really have a life of faith. And I kind of came out on the side that I could.
Okay. So from that point forward, you've been a person of faith, at least as it relates to God and Jesus.
Yeah.
Cool. And the divinity of Jesus and the resurrection, Son of God stuff?
Well, that's on a shelf.
That's on a shelf.
Yeah.
And the need
and it's
for
okay on a shelf.
The need for an atonement where Jesus has to die for your sins to be forgiven, is that part of that for you, or?
Not really.
Okay, that's not part of it.
That's kind of, I did talk about that in the rest of that paper. And this was something I wrote 20 years ago, but
right.
but I did kind of talk about that, and the way I talked about it was that Mormons have this unique scripture where they describe the suffering of Jesus, and it's this idea that God kind of had to put all of everybody's sins from the beginning of creation to the end on Jesus at that moment, and the way I came up with to define it was that it's not that. It's him identifying with human pain. Maybe I'll read that later when we'll
talk about that at the
appropriate part.
Yeah.
So we can do that later.
Okay. So law school. Did you want to mention the Hofmann murders?
Oh
in
yeah,
law school?
that happened while I was at law school.
Okay.
I was one day I had a night class. And so I kind of stayed over from my day classes to the night class, but I went to my car on the hour to listen to the news on the radio, and I heard about the bombings in Salt Lake. And it obviously, this was just shocking. We had no idea at first what was going on, and then the next day, I guess it was the next day, there was another bombing. And then a couple days later, Mark Hofmann blows himself up in his car. And really, nobody really knows what's going on. But I was not hugely connected to the alternative Mormon community at that point. I was reading stuff, but I wasn't really contributing very much. But I knew a lot of people who were, and we didn't know what was happening. So I went home and told my kids, if a package shows up on our front porch, do not touch it.
That's scary.
Yeah, because nobody knew why this was happening.
But you're still in California.
Yeah, I was still in California. It's not like I thought that there was a whole lot of risk. I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But until we knew more, I wanted to be safe. And then we had a Sunstone West out there. And I suggested that we do it at Santa Clara because it's close to an airport, it's accessible, there's parking, it's a lot of good reasons to do it there. And we had the university police there. They went through and checked everything, looked for any suspicious packages. So this was a big deal when this happened.
Sure.
But I did not realize at that point that I'd gone to the same ward as Mark Hofmann had.
Yeah. So did that shake your faith, or did that disturb you more?
It didn't.
Did it have anything to do with?
It didn't really have anything to do with my faith. It was just that it was a big moment within the Mormon community. Because we'd had all these things before Mark Hofmann, before the murders started. These documents and things were leaking out, and we were talking about them, and the Martin Harris letter that Mark had forged. A bunch of us had gotten together, and we had a big. George Smith is in California. It was at his house, and he had it printed on a big poster thing. We went and talked about it, and so there were within that kind of alternative community of Mormonism. All of these things were really interesting, and then all of a sudden people are being blown up, and then it turns out that he made it all up.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But I think our reaction there was probably about the same as people's reactions in other places.
Right. Okay, so you finished law school.
I did.
And you had written in your notes that maybe the church became a smaller part of your life in law school. Well,
yeah, I think I already talked about that. I was just so busy doing other stuff, but the church really it did occupy a much smaller part of my life at that point. Because I was busy, because I had a lot of stuff on the shelf about the church, and I was able to just kind of set it aside for a few years and not think about it too much.
But it looks like Sunstone kind of and other things kind of brought you back.
Well, in some ways, yeah. After I got out of law school, that was when I first started going to the Sunstone Symposium, and I started participating.
Now that was Albert Peck years?
Yeah, Albert Peck's years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I started participating, writing little papers and being on panels and stuff like that.
This is mid-'80s?
Yeah, I graduated in 86, so...
From which law school?
Santa Clara University.
Okay.
It's a Jesuit school.
Nice.
Yeah. And
so
I have to say...
professors?
Most of the professors were not Jesuits.
Okay.
I had one Jewish professor, Professor Levy, and he at one point had applied at he told us this story. He applied at what's the name of the school? It's a Christian law school down in the San Diego area, I think, Southern California. And he told us that when he went in for his interview, they asked him what he would do to bring Jesus Christ into the classroom at the law school. And he said, well, I would just invite him in. He'd have to prepare and be on call when it's his turn. Needless to say, he didn't get the job.
So that mid-'80s, late '80s is when things really started heating up with Sunstone.
They did.
That's when the church started denouncing symposia.
Right.
And you were right in the thick of it, going every year to Sunstone.
Yeah, I was going every year.
And Paul was making a bunch of noise by that point.
Yeah, and Levina, and they had the, what was the group that started to look at abuse within the church.
Yeah, the Alliance.
The Mormon Alliance.
Mormon
yeah.
Alliance.
Yeah, Mormon Alliance.
That was Lavina.
Yeah, Lavina. It was Lavina and Paul and some other people. I don't remember who all was.
And Maxine and her friends would have been working on the book on feminism.
On feminism, yeah. Re-emerging Mormon feminism, yeah.
So that's exciting times.
Oh, it was, yeah. That was a great time. There were lots of things that were coming out, and I was just really enjoying all of the new scholarship and everything. And okay, so then at that point, not only did I sort of reevaluate my faith and come to think about it in different ways, I also decided, if I'm going to be here, I'm going to make a difference. So I actually did a Sunstone paper on this eventually, about how to speak up in church so that you don't just go there and hear the most conservative voices because everybody else is afraid to say anything. So what I started doing is I started reading lessons in advance so I knew what they were going to be about. And by this time, I've accumulated quite a bit of knowledge on a lot of topics, a lot of religious topics. And so, and about history and context. And so I started going into my classes prepared to talk about things in a different way. And it was really interesting. There were, I think, probably a few people who really disliked my speaking up. But Mormons tend not to tell you if they dislike what you're doing.
For sure.
And there were many people who loved it. So I figured out that if you're prepared, and if you have interesting thoughts that put a new interpretation on Scripture, for instance, you can start a whole new discussion in class. Mm-hmm. And make it really interesting. So I spent time doing that, and I got to really quite enjoy going to classes and being able to do that.
And that was in California.
Yeah, it was in California, and it was very different when I came to Utah.
Right.
Preview for what's coming.
But that's a lot of work to study the lesson beforehand.
Yeah, it is.
And to be careful how you say it, and the worrying about who you're offending and what they may be saying behind your back, right? It kind of wears on you, doesn't it, or does it?
It didn't too much, because I quite enjoyed doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, and
sounds like you didn't catch a lot of heat for it.
I did not catch a lot of heat for it. I caught hardly any heat for it.
That's nice.
And then in the 90s, the internet starts emerging. And you kind of start seeing the limits of where you can go at that point, because people start bringing in a few more things. I can remember one Sunday school teacher who brought in some things that were, I think it might have been about the different versions of the first vision, and talked about him in class. And he got called into the bishop's office and asked not to do that anymore. And so I'm sure that there was a lot of that went on. But I found that there are a lot of things that you could do to just, things that were even quite positive. Different ways to have an application of Scripture that helps broaden people's views. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed doing it. And I didn't always do it. I didn't do it every week. But a lot of times I did it. And I knew enough by this time, especially about the Bible. It was harder when we were doing church history or Book of Mormon, the areas that I didn't know as well. But for my academic study, I knew a lot more about the Bible, and so I could talk about those. And sometimes it's not even a matter of saying anything contrary, but a matter of talking about context and about maybe a part of the reading that's assigned for that week that isn't intended to be the part of the lesson, but you can say, well, here in this part of the verse it says.
Mm-hmm.
So
and take it in a new direction.
Yeah, you just take it in a new direction. And doing that actually made going to church a lot more fun for me. And I felt like I made a positive contribution most of the time. There were times when I know I said things that were offensive, and then I had to kind of repent and rethink what I was doing and saying. But most of the time it worked out quite well.
I'm guessing that some of that had to do with who your bishop and stake president were, and equity had built up in the ward.
Yeah, some of it probably did. Although I continued to do it when we got a really conservative bishop also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. Well, that's a challenge for our attending listeners.
Absolutely. And if you're still going to church, I really highly recommend that. You can make church a lot more interesting if you do it, and you can get people to think.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the 90s and talk about the church's involvement in the homosexual problem.
Yeah. Okay. Before I really knew about some of the things the church was doing, like especially in Hawaii.
I'm trying to wonder.
There were some things.
What year was the Hawaii stuff? Do you know?
I'm thinking it was 1994, 95, maybe 93, even a little bit earlier. It was going on before I knew about it, so I can't say exactly when it started. I have looked at that, but I don't remember.
But 93 was when the September 6th was communicated.
September 6th in 93.
And when would Packer have declared gays, feminists, and intellectuals the great enemies of the church?
That was before that.
Would have been before.
Yeah,
but that's stewing.
Yeah, that's definitely stewing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, that was, I think, part of the things that the Mormon Alliance talked about. I can remember Lavina saying, "Well, I'm a feminist, I'm an intellectual, and I'm not gay, but I'm gay friendly." Mm-hmm. And so you sort of...
She's a triple threat.
Right, exactly. And I felt pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I was sort of determined at that point in my life to make a place for myself in the church, to be there and to not be silenced, and to speak up on these issues in a way that would help educate people. And of course, everybody already knew I was a feminist, so that there was nothing new about that. So in the 90s, what was happening was, I think this was very much on the radar of church leaders, that things were changing as far as gay people were concerned. We'd been through the AIDS crisis by then, which really catapulted gay issues into the national consciousness, I think, when we went through the whole HIV epidemic. And of course, Carolyn Pearson's husband died from...
Gerald.
Yeah, Gerald died.
Did you know Gerald?
I never knew Gerald.
Never met.
I think they split up before I actually met Carolyn. Sure. When one of my friends who was a friend of Sonia's, and she lived not too far from me, and her husband was in the state presidency, and she was a really good friend, and she had gone to school with Carolyn, and so she kind of helped me meet Carolyn. And so I went up to Concord, to Walnut Creek a couple of times and talked to Carolyn. And then Carolyn did her play, her Mother Wolf the Morning. Mm-hmm. And we went up and saw that together.
What was that like to see her do that?
Oh, it was really fun. And to see her perform it. I loved her live performance of it. She made a video also. And I didn't like the video as well as I liked seeing her do it herself.
Course.
I mean, live, it was just awesome.
Carolyn Pearson live?
Yeah.
It's magical.
The video was disappointing after seeing it live, I guess is how I would say it.
What can compare to the real deal?
Exactly. Yeah. And so Carolyn and I, we talked about these things quite a bit, and she also talked to me about women's issues in the church and recommended some reading materials for me, but that was clear back in the late 70s or early 80s.
Yeah.
When I first got to know her. So anyway, in the 90s, the gay issues were heating up because in California, like local governments, for instance, were passing domestic partnership laws. And I know these were on the church's radar. And there's one memo that I've seen that eventually leaked out where I think it was from Oaks. where he says we might have to concede on some issues like hospital visitation and like living arrangements or something like that in order to ward off, that's not the word, but in order to avoid same-sex marriage. I think maybe in some ways it was on their radar before it was on mine, that they could see the same-sex marriage.
Well, didn't Oakes write his memo in like 82? Like the first year he's inducted as an apostle?
Which memo?
He wrote some memo about strategy for dealing with the gay menace, and those are my words.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
Like as I understand
I think
it,
he
like
did.
in the early 80s.
I think he did write something in the early 80s, and that was totally not on my radar at that time.
Yeah.
But I have seen it. But yeah, they were certainly aware that legislation was changing, and that gay people were being included in anti-discrimination law, but they were, at some point they became focused on the end goal, which was stopping same-sex marriage. But there was this one time when one of the, I think it might have been the San Jose City Council or Santa Clara, somewhere there, was going to pass a domestic partners ordinance. And the bishop got up in sacrament meeting, right at the beginning of sacrament meeting, right before the sacrament, and read this letter asking people to write letters and oppose this. And it wasn't even Cupertino, I don't think. It was like, it might have been the county. It might have been Santa Clara County. So then we would have been part of it. And it was like being punched in the stomach. I was the ward chorister. For years I was the ward chorister. It was a calling I absolutely loved because I got to choose all the music. And so it really upset me a lot when they did that. And
again, what was it that made you sensitive to LGBT issues in the early 90s, mid-90s? Was it Carolyn?
Well, I'd certainly, I knew what had gone on with her. I think that was part of it. And part of it was that I sort of came to figure out that part of the reason, and I might be wrong on this, but I don't think I am, part of the reason the church fights homosexuality has to do with their strict gender roles for men and women.
Yeah.
And you can't have two men or two women be married to each other because you have to have one woman and one person in the woman role and one person in the man role, and you can't have that if they're the same. Right. People. So I mean, same sex, and so.
And for me, what's core to that is prophetic authority. If Joseph Smith didn't leave discussion about same-sex marriage, and the Book of Mormon doesn't,
right. It's nowhere in Scripture.
Then you have to be unraveling what scriptures or past prophets or adding things, and there's no discussion of it. So it ultimately undermines prophetic authority to be making accommodations for it.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, because he didn't think of it in advance.
It's not the Book of Mormon, it's not the Doctrine and Covenants, it's not the Plan of Salvation.
Yeah. No, it isn't.
So.
And Jesus never said anything about it.
Jesus didn't talk about it much, so.
At all.
Nope.
Yeah, so, but on top of not liking them being involved in this issue, I really was upset that they did it in sacrament meeting. And so I wrote a letter to I think I wrote it to the area president. I'm not, it might not have been the area president, but it was someone. I wrote a letter, which, and I copied the bishop and the stake president on it, so it's not like they were blindsided, but the stake president was asked to talk to me. So we had a meeting, and that was in, I think, about 1995. I think maybe in the summer of 95. And it was an interesting discussion because we talked about the way the church treats homosexuals and the way the church treats women. It kind of hit on the discussion talked about both of those kinds of things, and he just wanted me to not write letters anymore.
Cause them trouble.
Yeah, I think so. And the only reason I really bring that up is as background, to show that he and I had a history of talking about these kinds of things already, and he understood that I didn't think the church should be involved in politics, and of course he's saying it's a moral issue. And I said, yes, it's a moral issue. The church has a right to its moral stance, but they aren't just leaving it at that. They aren't just taking a moral stand. They're involved in the political aspect of this, and that involves not just church members, but it involves everybody. And everybody doesn't believe the same as the church. And there are people who are homosexual, and I don't know why they're homosexual, but they are, and they deserve to have a life, the life that they want to live, the life that they want to define. And so we were having that discussion at the time. Well, I didn't know. Well, I did know that the church was involved. By this time I did know that the church was involved over in Hawaii. I didn't know a lot about it, but I knew that there was some stuff going on over in Hawaii. And because the Hawaii Supreme Court had found their law unconstitutional under the state constitution, which would pave the way for same-sex marriage. But it didn't immediately bring about same-sex marriage, because as I understand what was happening in Hawaii, they would have to pass some enabling legislation for people of the same sex to get married. So it's not like in California, where they threw out the gender distinction and therefore same-sex marriage was legal as soon as the 30-day period passed for the ruling to be final, or whatever it was. So in Hawaii, the Supreme Court ruling meant that there continued to be a battle about same-sex marriage. And so I was sort of vaguely aware, and I was sort of vaguely aware that the church was involved in it, but I didn't know a whole lot about what they were doing, because that wasn't my state. So, let's see. Then what happened was they issued the Proclamation on the Family.
And what year was that?
1995.
Okay.
September of 1995. So we had Sunstone in August of 1995. And then the women's meeting, which was in September, is when it was introduced. And Gordon Hinckley, I don't know why he chose the women's meeting to introduce it, but whatever. That's what he did.
Because really it's about putting women in their place, isn't it? Isn't that what the document's about?
Yeah, it is. But I read the Proclamation on the Family, and obviously it upset me that they made gender an eternal characteristic. So women are eternally subordinated. Not just in this life, because Eve ate the fruit, and so therefore she's got a curse on her, and women are subordinate. But from forever. Because Mormons believe that you're forever. You were an intelligence before you were a spirit. And even your intelligence apparently has gender. And femaleness is subordinated to maleness. So that part of it was troubling to me. Just on my regular, normal feminist grounds. But I saw it immediately as basically an anti-gay document. I understood it that way from the first time that I read it. So I went through it. I don't think I did that at this time. At some point I went through it and I marked out all the stuff that I would agree with. Families are important. Husbands and wives should support each other. Parents should love their children. Children have a right to grow up with their parents and with their parents' marriage. I mean, obviously that's an ideal, and it doesn't always happen. There's lots of single parents, and I felt, they're sort of marginalized by this too. But if we're going to talk about an ideal situation, parents who love their children is the best family in terms of being able to provide the best kind of nurturing for children. And I want to be careful about how I say that, because single parents do an amazing job. But I can agree that an ideal is when parents get together and love each other and love their children, and that's a great place to raise kids. I don't think they have to be straight in order to do that. But so there are some things about the proclamation that I was okay with, but the gender role stuff and the anti-gay stuff, even though they don't ever come out and say specifically, that homosexuals are evil or anything like that, but it's just the underlying current of it. You can see it, and I knew that as soon as it came out. But ironically, I don't think people necessarily saw it that way, because I remember that we had a sacrament meeting about the Proclamation on the Family, and people spoke, and they talked about how to have happy, successful families. They didn't talk about homosexuality at all. I don't think that raised that awareness in people who weren't already thinking about it. So, but I saw it immediately.
Sure.
So, come next summer, Sunstone, there's a panel, and the panel was called, as I already mentioned, Patriarchs and Politics, from the ERA to the Proclamation on the Family. And the participants were me, and I talked about the ERA and the Proclamation. I talked about both of them. Marty Bradley talked about the International Women's Year Conference. Lori Stromberg was one of the speakers. I can't remember now exactly what Lori talked about. And then Marilyn Warinsky had written the book Patriarchs and Politics. That was a book about the ERA and the church's involvement with the ERA.
She wasn't Mormon, right?
She was raised Mormon, but had left the church a long time before she wrote the book. And so she wrote about the church's opposition to the ERA, and certainly did not write in a way that Mormon leaders would consider respectful. So, but anyway, so when I already read part of this paper about what was leading up to it and my involvement with the ERA and the fundraising, and then I taught the second part of this paper was about the Proclamation on the Family specifically. And so what I did in that is I looked at proclamations in general in the church. And there were only 4 of them before the Proclamation on the Family. And if you had gone and asked in any ward, can you tell me anything about a proclamation that the church has ever done? Nobody would have told you anything. Nobody would remember anything about them. And so there was like one when Joseph Smith was killed, and it was a proclamation to the world about the end is coming. You need to repent. You need to come to the truth.
And there were the declarations for polygamy, right? The manifestos.
The manifestos.
But they weren't called proclamations.
No, they were not called proclamations.
Yeah, that is a new device.
Yeah.
That they use. Why proclamations?
And so there were these 4 proclamations.
Why not a revelation after all? Right?
Good question.
We're prophets, seers, and revelators, right?
And here's our revelation.
We talk to God. Why not just give a revelation?
I know. And instead
there must have been a conversation. What do we call this, right?
I'm sure there had to be. Yeah. Well,
they're so scared to be prophets, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, they really are. And after the proclamation came out, we had a regional conference. I think I don't remember if this was before or after I gave actually I think it was before I gave my Sunstone talk. And Elder Hales came, and Lauren Dunn. But Elder Hales, when he spoke, he talked about the proclamation. And he said that they spent more than a year writing it and discussing it and talking about it. And he said, you should study it sentence by sentence and even word by word. And I thought, well, they really put a lot of discussion time into this. And were really careful about their wording. And it must, for them to discuss it for a year, that sounds to me like they're hammering something out that everybody can agree on. It's not I don't know, I guess within the Mormon thought of, study it out in your own mind and God will confirm it, maybe that's revelatory, but it comes across as something that they and the lawyers wrote. So, anyway, I talked about what these 4 proclamations were. The last one was on April 6th, 1980. And I kind of remember this. You're probably too young, but Gordon B. Hinckley did a proclamation from, maybe I put where it was. It was from a historical site. It was for the sesquicentennial of the church, and it reaffirmed the sanctity of the family, pled with people of the earth to repent, and invited, quote, the honest in heart everywhere to listen to the teachings of our missionaries. So that was the 4th proclamation, and that's 1980. So 15 years later, then we get the proclamation on the family. And so nobody really knew what a what a proclamation was until we got it. So I kind of in this talk compared the family values rhetoric of the 1980 proclamation with the 1995 proclamation. And there were a lot of similarities, but the 1995 proclamation directs husband and wife to love and care for each other and rear their children in love and righteousness, warning that they will be held accountable before God for the discharge of their obligations. It reaffirms the patriarchal family, stating that fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness. So then I said this. Then it goes on to say mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of the children. And then I said, in a classic example of patriarchal doublespeak, it goes on to say that fathers and mothers are are obligated to help one another as equal partners. So they've just said that the father presides and the mother doesn't, but they're equal partners. And so I called that patriarchal doublespeak, and that was one of the things that got me in trouble. And so...
how do you preside in a relationship of equals?
Yeah, exactly. He's the one in charge. He's got the final say-so. So then I wrote this. I said, when I first read the proclamation, I immediately thought about the canonization of the 132nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants. Polygamy was practiced for decades before it was submitted for a vote of the saints and made scripture by the rule of common consent. This did not occur until Congress outlawed polygamy in Utah Territory, and the court battle was brewing over religious freedom and polygamy. I can't help but think that a similar motivation lies behind the issuance of the Proclamation on the Family. To the extent that the Proclamation talks about the importance of family, it is nothing new. The subtext on gender, however, is a further codification of the eternal patriarchal order, which was and is to come, further subordinating women from the pre-existence to the eternities. It is also a clear statement that the church leaders intend to resist any further societal legitimization of homosexual relationships. So I was seeing that right from the beginning. And then I explained why. Sometime in late 1994 or early 1995, the church attempted to intervene in the Hawaii litigation that might legitimize same-sex marriage. Intervention, that's a legal term, and it means the church tried to become a party to the lawsuit that was going on. So in other words, they didn't want to just submit a friend to the court brief. They were saying that these issues before this court are so integral to our interests as a church that we have to become a party so that we can fully litigate our interests in it. which was kind of a stretch of what the church's interests were, because the law was not going to force them to perform same-sex marriages. They're still entitled to their doctrine. They can still say that same-sex marriage is a sin. They can do whatever they want with that. But they would try to intervene.
But they considered the spread of same-sex marriage an existential threat.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, I think they do. They seem to. So, early in 1996, Mormons in California were instructed via a letter from Lauren Dunn to write their state legislators, as individual citizens, of course, in support of a bill that would prevent California from recognizing same-sex marriages. So this is 1996. And they are already telling Mormons to write, and I was there, I remember this, they're telling Mormons to write to their legislators to outlaw same-sex marriage. The Knight Initiative that eventually comes along is in the year 2000. So 4 years before the Knight Initiative, they're trying to get the legislature to enact it. About the same time, President Hinckley and Lauren Dunn visited Hawaii and urged Mormons there to work against the legalization of same-sex marriage. And I don't have a source for that, but a lot of those documents have been leaked and they're online. So I wrote this paper, and I said that I believe that the Proclamation on the Family was issued in large part because they wanted to have a doctrinal reason to be part of this, the court case, the litigation in Hawaii, and also to have that there for opposing same-sex marriage in the broader society as well. And I still believe that's true, and I think I've been vindicated, because they don't ever bring out the proclamation to say, let's help families by making sure that a minimum wage is high enough that parents can support their children. They don't bring it out to say, health care, medical bills, force families into bankruptcy. Let's have some kind of reasonable health care plans that will support families and help them take care of their health and their children's health. Let's have daycare policies that will benefit children so that if both parents have to work, children are going to be well taken care of. All of those things would really help families. We can do that. But the only thing they ever bring it out for is to fight same-sex marriage. And they've brought it up in, I won't say I've read every friend of the court brief they filed, but I've read a lot of them, and they bring it up every single time. And so I see the proclamation as being issued with a primary purpose to fight same-sex marriage. And I think that their record of what they've done with it vindicates that, my early assessment of it.
Okay, and yet you stayed active in the church.
Yeah, I did.
Now, how did this lead to a brush with church discipline?
Okay, well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
As far as staying active in the church, by this time, you know, I had a pretty good community of people who are in the church for a lot of reasons. It's my church as much as anybody else, for one thing. And I feel like I'm doing some good here. And I feel like I can help things be better. And I can participate in Sunstone and independent forums, and I can write, and I can help people think, and maybe I can have some kind of influence on this. And so, yeah, I stay active in the church. And so I do this paper, or this, I was one of the 4 panelists, and that's in the summer of 1996, and then my stake president gets a call from Lauren Dunn. And the first thing he gets is a phone call. And he let me know that. And he told me that he was going to need to talk to me. And I asked him, I wanted to know specifically what he wanted to talk to me about, because it's hard to go into a meeting cold and not know what the problem is, and then have to defend it without any opportunity to really have time to prepare. Of course, I knew what I said at Sunstone, so but it would have been, I thought I wanted to know a little bit more about what specifically had triggered it. So he said he was waiting for something from Elder Dunn. And so we couldn't set up a meeting yet. And then Elder Dunn was kind of slow getting something to him, but he finally did, and we went in, we had the meeting, and I started out the meeting by saying, before we get into whatever it is you want to talk to me about, I want to continue talking about some of the things we talked about before. And that was about, in our prior meeting where I'd written the letter, we were already discussing women's issues and gay issues. And so I went into the meeting and I started telling him some of the things that I had learned, and we talked about, like, the church has a booklet on understanding and helping those with homosexual problems, I think is the name of it. And he had given that to me, and it's not a secret book. It's something you can, at the time, you could go to the church outlets and buy it. And so he asked me to read it and tell him what I thought. And what I thought was that it wasn't very helpful. And what he let me know is that he was actually dealing with somebody in the stake who was gay and who was just crushed by his whole situation in the church. And so we had this, I thought it was a really productive conversation where we talked about these things. And then I said, okay, well, we better move on to what you want to talk to me about. And well, it turned out that what he wanted to talk to me about was the same things we were already discussing. So we had this talk, and it kind of went through some of the same things about, well, it's a moral issue. And with him saying that they have a right to be involved, and me saying, well, they certainly have a right to their doctrine, but I don't think they have a right to just have, to try to make all of society conform to the kinds of things that we believe in. And the meeting went on for quite a while, and in some ways it was really very productive, and in some ways it was troublesome. So I wrote about it a lot. I wrote up what happened, and let me see. He reiterated several times that the prophet is a prophet, and when he says something, we have to listen. I pointed out that there's a process for making a statement into doctrine, and that hasn't been done. Finally asked the question, what do you want me to do? He seemed to misinterpret the question a little and said he wasn't going to put a bag over my head. I said, well, that's not what I meant. I just want your opinion about whether you think there's something I should do. And so he advised me not to write any more letters.
Be quiet.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you can do.
Right. But at the same time, he was saying he didn't want to silence me, but what he wanted me to do was when I spoke up, support the prophet. And I knew that's what he wanted, but I couldn't give him that because I didn't support what the church was doing. So I kind of bore my testimony that I believed in Jesus and believed he was my Savior. And I think that was very touching to him, very meaningful to him, and so we got through it. And he asked me if I sustained the prophet, and I said, sure I do, but that probably means something different to me than it does to you.
Yeah. Right.
And I said that I didn't think that it meant that I always had to agree with him. And I pointed out that I believe in our way of life. I believe that we should live the kind of life in general that church leaders tell us to live. I pointed out that he probably gets more compliance out of me on a lot of things than he does from many other people, because mostly I was living the standard, Mormon life, doing what I was supposed to do. But anyway, then he told me that the bishop wanted to get in on this. The bishop wanted to know what was going on. And so I told him he could talk to the bishop. Well, then they set up, there were a couple things actually. First of all, he read to me what Lauren Dunn had sent to him. And what it sounded like, my guess about what it was that he read was, and I might be wrong, but I think that the Strengthening Church Members Committee has people who listen to these talks, and that they then apprise the general authorities of what's in them. And then the general authorities decide what they need to take action on. What he read to me it told me that it named all the people on the panel. It said which ones of us were members and which one was not. And it said some of the things that were said that were obviously troubling to whoever was writing this memo. And I was able to get enough information from him so that I could write a letter to Lauren Dunn, who is the one that gave this to him. And in order to do that, I needed to know specifically some of the things that were in the memo and that were troubling. Well, I went back and listened to the tape, and some of the things that seemed to bother them the most were things that were either said by Marilyn Warensky, or they were said in the Q&A session afterward. It was said by somebody who wasn't even on the panel. But there were two things that were troublesome to them about what I said. And one was the part about saying patriarchal doublespeak. I'm trying to remember what the other one was. I eventually wrote this up, but it's not easy to put my hands right on it. Okay. So I pointed out that I didn't say some of this stuff. And then I said, as for the statements I did make, and this is this letter I wrote to the stake president, I think you will find that they did not sound harsh or strident when taken in the context of the rest of my description and summary of the proclamation as a whole. I intended my comments to be primarily descriptive of the proclamation, not critical of it. And even though I can see now why they found it critical, it really was not my intent. As for my remarks about the political motivations for issuing the proclamation, those motivations seem obvious in light of the concluding statement of the proclamation. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as a fundamental unit of society. So they were kind of objecting to me calling it a political statement, when right in the document itself, it's urging political action. So I thought that was kind of an unfair criticism.
And the whole document was born out of political activism on the church's part,
Absolutely,
right?
It was.
Like, you didn't talk about who authored the original draft of the...
No, I didn't. I don't think I even knew that at the time.
Okay.
So no, I didn't talk about that. But I mean,
wasn't the Proclamation of the Family drafted by some lawyer who was involved in the Hawaii case or something like that?
I don't think it was drafted solely by the lawyers. I think it had a lot of involvement by the lawyers. I think the lawyers told them what they needed to have in the proclamation in order to make their argument that the church should be allowed to intervene and that the church should have this bigger role that they wanted. So I do think there was input from the lawyers, but I don't necessarily think they wrote it, although maybe they did. And maybe that year of having the apostles talk about it, that Elder Hales talked about, and he said this publicly, so this is not a secret, and he talked about them discussing it for a year. Maybe they got a draft from the lawyers, and then they went over it and tweaked it. I don't know.
Because it was used to get standing in the court.
I think
to claim that the church had a direct interest in being involved in these court cases.
They were not granted standing.
Yeah.
But I think that they wrote it
to get
as
them standing.
Part of the reason they wrote it was that they wanted to have standing. And that's
it makes sense that lawyers would draft it.
Yeah. I think they knew exactly what the lawyers, and maybe not even necessarily for the Hawaii case, but for cases in the future where they wanted to have a bigger role in litigation. Yes, I do think lawyers were involved in terms of putting in it what they felt needed to be there in order for them to gain standing. And I might be wrong about that, but that was my early on impression, and I seem to have been right about quite a few things. So I told him that I didn't think that Elder Dunn had even listened to the tape, if those were his words, because I felt like he really misrepresented what was in it. So then in November, we had a meeting with the bishop and the stake president, and that was one of the most tense meetings I've ever had in my life. It lasted 2 hours, and I asked that they allow my husband to come too. He had felt like I was getting picked on, and so he just wanted to be there. And at that point, I was outnumbered if I went alone. So I had him come as well. And so we spent 2 hours. And the bishop had listened to at least parts of some of the tapes. And so kind of right at the beginning of the meeting, he said that he was really taken aback. I think he said he was shocked by what he said. And he said, I could hardly believe that the Nadine he heard on the tape was the same Nadine who had been in his office many times to talk with him about the needs of other people. And so this was a difficult way.
That's to shame you.
Well, I don't think he thought of it as shaming. I think he just, I think he really was in shock that he didn't, this was a side of me he didn't know, I guess. But I asked him to be more specific, and we were able to talk through some of the things that were bothersome to him. He didn't. Okay, well, there was one thing where I had made a comment, and I think it might even have been an ad lib, where I said that we were asked to write as individual citizens, and I said, yeah, and I did write as an individual citizen. And it was clear from what I said that when I wrote, I didn't write the way they wanted to. And he saw that as me being sarcastic. So, and then he didn't like my use of the term of patriarchal doublespeak. And so I tried to explain what I meant by that. And they didn't seem to be familiar with the concept of doublespeak. So I had to explain that it came from Orwell's book of 1984. And then I explained that if you say that the husband and wife are equal, but you make the man...
All animals are equal, some are more equal than others.
Exactly. I wish I'd have thought to say that, but I didn't. And so then I told them that part of my big concern about this political involvement is that when you're out lobbying against something like this, you have to, in order to get people to do it, you got to stir them up to think that there's a real threat. And I just felt like this is so troublesome that what's going to happen is they're going to wind up vilifying homosexuals as this existential threat to the family. which of course is what happens, what did happen. And they were willing to acknowledge that I was a compassionate person, but I still needed to follow the prophet. So finally, we got to a place where something came up. Well, here's one part of it. I tried to explain to them how it is that the church subordinates women, because that's something that's so hard for people to see. You know, they love their wives, they are good to their wives, they do everything they can to make their wives happy. They feel like they're doing everything they can to be supportive of women. They try to listen to women in the wards and stakes. I think local leaders do a much better job of doing that than the leaders at the top of the church. And so they just have a real hard time seeing the way the church's rhetoric impacts people. So this is how I described it. And another point, I tried to explain that the church subordinates women with this gender rhetoric by defining narrow roles for women and by always having men be in charge. They both assured me that the church doesn't think that women are subordinate. I picked up President so-and-so's Bible and said, "May I?" He said, "Sure." I said, "I get really annoyed at the church's insistence on rigid sex roles. So one day I decided to see if the term role is mentioned anywhere in Scripture." Of course, you know, I knew it wasn't going to be, but I plugged it into my electronic scriptures and it appeared one time. Not in the Scriptures per se, but in the church's header in Genesis chapter 3. I read the header out loud, which included the terms role of woman and of man. I read the only verse applicable to women. "Unto the woman," he said, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and that thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee."
Your role is sorrow.
Yes. "And subordination to your husband, and he shall rule over thee." So that's the church's view of the role of women, I said. And then so then the stake president protested that the church doesn't really think that. And I said, "I know the brethren didn't write the header, but this is the church's official work." And I said, "They could have put the term role of woman at the top of Proverbs chapter 31. Now, they didn't know what that was. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is the chapter on the virtuous woman. And I thought they would know, but Merlin then noticed that they were puzzled and told them that was a chapter about the virtuous woman. I was really glad to know that he knew. And so then I added that she was a businesswoman and she bought real property. And he wrote down the reference. So I hope he went home and read it. And so then this other thing happened. And in order to tell about it, I have to tell another story that goes back a little ways. Before there was before there was the internet, there were email lists that Mormons were on. And I was on one list that was called I-Ring-L, and it was a science email. So you'd send your email to the I-Ring-L address, and it would go out to all the subscribers of that list. Were you ever involved in any of that? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there was Mormon L.
Mormon L.
Yeah, I was never on Mormon L, but I was
one called Loyal Liberal Mormons.
Oh, I didn't ever. Oh, that one sounds fun.
It was like a Yahoo group.
Well, one of the things that had come up on I-Ring-L was the fact that the church had this packet on evolution that they did at BYU, and somebody had said that if you ask the church for their official statement on evolution, that they will send you an official statement, which is basically the entry in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism on evolution. So I had that as background. And then at this time, my son Alan had gotten married, and his wife was a convert, and they got married, and then a year later they went to the temple. So they were in the temple prep class, and the temple prep class was being taught by the resident stake creationist. He was a former stake president, and so he had spent some time in the temple prep class talking about, I don't know why they had to talk about this, but talking about this young earth, and creationism. And my daughter-in-law, who grew up a nominal Catholic, she had her education in Catholic schools, was just flabbergasted that the church even believed this, that there was no evolution. Yeah, the young earth, and so I decided, I really want to have this official statement, because he's teaching something to my daughter-in-law that's upsetting to her about this church that she's joined. And she's really even wondering if she even wants to go to the temple at this point. So I called up, I used the church's 800 number, and I told them what I wanted. And they transferred me to the First Presidency's office. And I got a hold of somebody there who told me, who didn't seem to know what I was talking about. And I said, no, please, I've been told that that you could send something to me that would be the church's official position on evolution. And so she put me on hold and then came back and said that they could send me something, but I had to write a letter. So I sent a letter, and I don't remember if I addressed it to the First Presidency or to the secretary, who I think was F. Michael Watson. Yeah, it was F. Michael Watson. And
he's an interesting dude.
Is he? I don't know anything about him other than that he was the...
He was a major power broker back in the day.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. But I sent him this letter, and I just... You know what I thought? I thought this would go to the First Presidency's office, and somebody would photocopy a statement and put it in the mail and send it to me. That's honestly what I thought was going to happen. Well, instead, about a week later, I got this letter from F. Michael Watson. And it says, Dear Sister Hansen, I've been asked to acknowledge your letter of June 8, 1995 regarding the Church's position on evolution. Your stake president, so-and-so, has been advised in a letter from the First Presidency that a member of his stake has raised this question. If you will contact President so-and-so and identify yourself as the member who raised the question, he will be pleased to read the letter answering you.
Whoa.
And then I've also been asked to thank you for your inquiry and to extend the best wishes to you. So I thought, if this is the statement from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, why go through all this? So I called up the stake president, and when I did, I had the Encyclopedia of Mormonism statement in front of me. And so he read me the letter, and it was a statement from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, but with some places, I was able to strike out anything that wasn't in this article and to interpolate in anything that wasn't here. And it was mostly just like connecting words and phrases. The substance was exactly the same. So I made all the corrections that he told me, and then I sent it to Irene Yell, and then Mel Tungate put it up, and it's on the internet. So if you want to know what the letter says, that will not be sent to you, but will be sent to your stake president, you can go on Mel's website and you can read it. And I just thought that was so crazy to do it that way, rather than to just send it to me.
Well, I didn't get, when I appealed my excommunication, they wouldn't send it to me.
Yeah,
They sent the appeal to the stake president. So, I
Right.
mean, maybe that's a long-standing,
they just
they don't
have to go through
acknowledge
channels.
individual members.
Yeah,
They filter everything through stake president.
right. Well,
Interesting.
that very well could be. Well, so this meeting was very, very tense, and they both wanted me to get with the program. And so so I told the story. The stake president already knew about. But I pointed out that this other guy, who is a former stake president, goes around teaching this creationist stuff as doctrine. And nobody says anything to him, although I think maybe they did, but after this. But I had this one place where
They
when
said to him,
when
stop upsetting Nadine.
Yeah, stop upsetting Nadine.
Getting on her nerves. She's causing us trouble.
That's right. So anyway, I explained to the bishop about what happened, just kind of the explanation I gave to you, and then I said, so now I have this official statement of the First Presidency, and it's a statement of neutrality on evolution. And I went and tried to have a talk with so-and-so and asked him not to state that his views are church doctrine, because they're not. But it was an exercise in futility, and he still teaches this creationist nonsense as church doctrine, and it isn't doctrine, it's false doctrine. This was just kind of an outburst for me at this point. Now, I don't want you guys to be his thought police any more than I want you to be my thought police. But I sure don't understand why it is that not only does nobody tell him he can't teach this stuff, but they give him a forum to teach it. And it's in direct contradiction of the First Presidency statement. And I didn't teach any false doctrine, but here we are, considering whether or not I should have a temple recommend, and even whether I'm going to be allowed to stay in the church, and I consider that a real double standard. And that kind of, at the end of that, there was just silence. And then the stake president, they just looked at each other, and then the stake president said, well, we're not really speechless. But they really kind of were. And so we had a few more things to talk about, but that was such a tense meeting. I went home, I barely even slept that night. And I think they left the meeting thinking everything was great, and everything was that we'd accomplished a lot, and that everybody, had a love fest. Because I think that's the way they experienced the meeting, but I sure didn't.
What was it for you?
Oh man, it was just really tense throughout, of feeling pressured to be silent, basically. Mm-hmm. Although it didn't end that way. And then after I had a day to think about it, I was able to think about really some of the positive things that had happened in the meeting, and it really wasn't as bad as I felt when I went home. But the reason I tell that story is I think people who are subject to this sort of informal church discipline experience it very differently than the leaders of the church experience it. I have had Mormon leaders tell me how loving and wonderful church disciplinary councils are. Yeah. Now, did you feel loved in your church disciplinary
loving?
council?
No.
And of course, most disciplinary councils aren't like yours with a foregone conclusion that you're guilty of apostasy, but they are about things that are very personal, and I don't doubt that people come out of disciplinary councils sometimes feeling forgiven and feeling like it was worthwhile to go through the process because they've been through something hard and they want to find meaning in it.
Right.
But I really think that those who go through disciplinary councils have a lot of trauma from them. I've read enough stories from people who have been in them to know that they actually can be very, very traumatic. And I don't think the leaders that do them always get that. I think a lot of times they don't get it.
Now they're focused on being obedient, following the rules.
Right. Yeah. And I think that they genuinely do feel love for this repentant sinner, and they genuinely do feel that they're helping them to make a change in their life. And I don't doubt that often they do help them make a change in their life and help them move forward and help them forgive themselves and help. A lot of these are about adultery, and I think that they help them to find ways to put their relationships back together. I'm not saying that they don't do a lot of good in doing it, but I also think they really don't get how traumatic it is. I wasn't even in a church court. I was just in a meeting. And that's one other thing. What I didn't realize then, there was one point in one of the early meetings with the stake president where I asked him if my church membership was in jeopardy, and he said, "No, I don't think so, but I need to counsel you." Now, what I didn't know when he said that, and I didn't know until later when I read it in the handbook, is caution and counsel is the first level of church discipline.
Right.
And the reason that's important is counsel and caution is there when, as the first level, and if you obey their counsel and are cautioned, that's the end of it. But if you don't, it escalates from there.
Right.
And so the next step, and this is what I was starting to feel in this meeting, was I was not going along with what they were telling me to do, and the next step could be more formal discipline.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway,
So it's informal formal discipline.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a step of the formal disciplinary process.
It's the step in the disciplinary process, which we talked a little bit about my son. Well, I don't know. Actually, what went on with him came a little bit later when they were doing Prop 22. So I don't know. This is kind of the end of what was going on.
Okay.
So if you want to do another break now, and then we can come back and talk about Prop 22, the Knight Initiative.
So that takes us up into the 90s, the Proclamation on the Family, your
Right.
brush with church discipline. You were not disciplined.
I was not disciplined. I
Formally,
think, no.
you were
and
punished.
actually, no, I was not punished. And actually, I think in the end, we came out quite good friends. After we moved to Utah, we actually went on a cruise to Alaska with the stake president and his wife.
Wow.
So we came out of it with some really good feelings and good friendship. But I think it's important to tell this story because of what, Lauren Dunn contacted my stake president. We pretend that this all originates locally, and it does not. And there were things in his memo that basically told the stake. There was a part of the memo that was called church disciplinary issues. What kinds of issues were brought up that would trigger church discipline? So the stake president, I don't know if this is the kind of memo that all stake presidents get, but it's the one that my stake president got. And if this is a pattern, then that's what stake presidents are hearing. You can't be a stake president and get a memo like that and think that you're going to, that you're not being directed to do something about this person. And depending on the personality of the stake president, and in fact, at one point, I found out that Lauren Dunn asked him if I had a temple recommend, and I did. And Lauren Dunn told him he might want to rethink that decision. So leaders at the general level are more involved than they tell the press.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's an important story to tell. And then after that was in 1996. Then in 1997, one of the things I think that helped that end on a good note was that I didn't have any plans for another paper about the Proclamation on the Family. And they kind of asked me what I was doing. And I said, for the next Sunstone West, which was coming up, I'm putting together a panel on what the atonement means to me.
Oh.
And that was what I wrote that I read part of earlier.
Got it.
And that, so.
Okay. So just to close out this episode, I want to thank everyone who's joined us. So far, we're 4 hours in, I think, to this interview. This is the end of part 3 with Nadine McCombs Hansen. Merlin's joined us on Facebook.
Oh, good. Hi, Merlin.
So we've had 3 great episodes. Just to let you guys know, the final section that we're going to be having is going to be talking about, Prop 22, and then Proposition 8, and Nadine's involvement in sort of opposing the church's stances on same-sex marriage. We will get into how that led to her, what happened in November of 2015 and what it's done to her membership. And then a part that I'm really interested in talking about is just as someone who's trying to make a difference in 2016 and the 2017 and beyond. I would like to talk to her just a bit about where we are today in Mormon studies and Mormon activism and feminism, the LGBT issue, where the church is with the essays, and just kind of reflect on where we are and where we might be going. So that'll be kind of the last episode we have. We're going to break for dinner. But we just want to thank all our listeners for joining us. Always, please make your comments at mormonstories.org. For those who are listening by podcast, we appreciate any financial support you guys can offer, because that's what makes all this possible. And of course, we want to thank our listeners on Mormon Stories Live who have been joining us live. It's fun to have people join us live to make their comments and questions and suggestions there. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, and please join us for part 4 coming up soon. We sure appreciate it, and you guys take care. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Nadine.
Okay.